so you made it to part 2 of Augustine's on the Trinity. He gives us the psychological analogy, and I told you he gets really abstract because we're talking about a God who's immaterial and unimaginable. So how do we get an image for an unimaginable God? So bear with him. The whiteboard this time is going to really have 2 major parts to it. So hang on, we're going to give one try at this analogy, and then we're going to see where Augustine is not satisfied, so he's going to give a second take on it. And each are important to get the logic and the steps of where he's going with the argument. So, well, let's see how we do with it. All right, in this second part of our treatment of the psychological analogy of the Trinity from Augustine's work entitled On the Trinity, we're in Book 9, and we've moved past that initial diagram where he thinks of God as a lover and beloved and the love between them. And now he's going to take a step back and think about a God who is a mind, or at least like a mind. Now, what is a mind? What does a mind look like? Well, the answer is a soul, or a rational mind, for Augustine, is invisible. But for the sake of our understanding, I'm just going to draw this circle here to locate what we mean by a mind. Now, at this point, we can remind ourselves that there are many things a mind can do, and Augustine goes at some length to think that the mind, ultimately, the activities of the mind can be summarized in 2 ways. A mind can know, and a mind can love. Let's start by focusing just on just on the knowledge. If a mind knows all sorts of things, a mind can know itself. And now, if we have the mind and the knowledge of the mind, we have not just one, but 2. And if the mind truly knows itself, and doesn't know something else, or know part of itself, or most of itself, then you would ask, what is the substance of this knowledge? And if the knowledge is truly of the mind itself, and if I could draw a better circle, I could better depict that the substance of the knowledge would be the mind itself. The 2 are really the same substance. Now, at this point, you would recognize that the mind knowing itself is not just 1 but 2, but the mind would then, if it is truly lovable and lovely, the mind would love itself. And then you would have not just 1, not just 2, but 3. You would have the mind, the knowledge of the mind, and the love of the mind. Now, if you then say that the mind knowing itself is truly loving itself, and loving all of itself, not just part of itself, we come back to our same question. What is the substance of this love? And the answer is, it would be the mind itself, because it is the love of the mind itself. And it would be the knowledge itself, because it is the love of the knowledge of the mind. You can't love something if you don't know something. So now we have 3 that are homoousios. Isn't this what we were looking for in those other social analogies? Don't we want 3 persona who are fully equal? Well, there is a problem here that you might bring up. First, you may remember that Augustine is very clear to point out that the knowledge is actually born of the mind. He likes the fact that our language keeps this idea, as if the knowledge is begotten of the mind, born in mind. And that means that we have something prior to something else. And the same is true about this love. This love is something that proceeds from the mind, and not just from the mind, but from the knowledge of the mind. It is the mind that is loving, and you can't love something unless you know something. So it is the mind that loves, and it is the love of both the mind and the knowledge of the mind. As an aside, this second arrow is known as the filioque clause, something we don't have time to go into here. So now it seems that our model is not quite as equal in appearance as we wanted. When we looked at that first social analogy that turned out to be from Jürgen Moltmann, there was no hierarchy at all within the Godhead. Here we still have a hierarchy. And you could ask those same questions of this analogy. Does this give us some sort of subordination? And it appears to, but then we have to go back and ask, is this a chronological subordination? Is there a priority in time between the mind and the knowledge of the mind and the love of the mind? And for Augustine it clearly is not. When did God know God's self and love God's self? The answer is eternally. So this is certainly not a chronological subordination, but you could ask, is this an ontological subordination? And again, Augustine is very clear on the fact that there is no difference in substance. They're the same substance. The knowledge is not less than the mind, the love is not less than the mind or the knowledge of the mind, so there is no difference in ontology. So then, if this is not subordinationism at all, what are we looking at? Well, as with Gregory of Nyssa's model, there is still a hierarchy here. And it's a causalogical hierarchy, because it is the mind who knows and the mind who loves. And there is a priority here of the mind over the knowledge and love. But remember, it is a logical, not chronological priority. So is this good enough, or are there still problems? Well, it does look like, if not subordinationism, some sort of inequality, just like Gregory's model. What's worse, there's another problem here that we might spot. We keep saying there are three persons or persona, but are they? It looks like the mind is a real personal entity. But knowledge of the mind and love of the mind, these don't seem like who, they seem like a what. Of course, if you remember, we started with that preliminary model, and it was only the Spirit that was less than the Father and the Son, or appeared less personal than the Father and the Son. Augustine seems to have regressed. We have one clearly personal entity here, and two seemingly impersonal entities. Now, I'm going to do a very quick defense of this one, much like I did the other. First, I would just point out that what Augustine wants to say about this is, if this looks like one person is very personal and the other two look impersonal, at least it's biblical. Have you ever noticed how in the Bible, when the Bible says God, the Bible tends to be talking about the Father? And sometimes the Bible describes Jesus as the Word of God spoken forth. This says Word over here. And the Spirit, literally Spirit, and in its Greek and Hebrew form, that word is breath or wind. And you can't speak forth a word without a breath, and a breath coming forth from God is always a rational one, so there is included there the Word. Now clearly in the Bible, and for Augustine, the Word and the breath of God are personal entities, but it's uncanny that you can speak of God in a very personal terms and speak of the second and third person in what seems like impersonal terms. So it's biblical is the first defense. Also, this is provisional. Augustine is not finished. We have to look at what he does in Book 10 to see how he tries to get fully equal in terms of personal entities. To do that, let's start over on this diagram.
Hey, still there, right? You're awake? Okay. I told you this is abstract, but remember, this is the foundational model for all Western Trinitarianism. If you are a product of Western Christianity, as all Protestants are, then this is the foundation for how you really talk about the Trinity. So we're almost there. One more segment of this is where he's going to take it at an even more abstract level, if that's possible. But I think there's some steps along the way that will make this easy to digest. We're looking for 3 parts and how they are one. So a little bit further, and we'll have all the pieces of the puzzle put together.
This whole time we've been talking about a mind and what a mind does, like love and know, but we haven't really asked what a mind is. What is your mind? Well, Augustine thinks he knows. But this is going to be really strange to how we think of psychology or the psyche. But for the sake of argument, you're just going to have to trust Augustine, even though this is not how we would describe things. First, he's going to say that a mind actually consists of, or is made up of, memory. Now, what does it look like to have memories? Well, you can't really see memories, but let's just diagram them here. And imagine if you had no memories. Imagine if you couldn't remember the beginning of this sentence by the time I get to the end of this sentence. It's kind of like what it feels like when you read Augustine. But if that were the case, if you had no memory at all, you would not really be a rational mind. I don't want to risk being insensitive here, but in the hospital, if someone has completely lost all memory function, they're strictly classified as not animal, anima being soul. They're not animal, but vegetable, in a vegetative state. They have no rational function at all. So Augustine is on to something here to say that our mind itself consists of memory. Let's start with memory, and then we have to add something. We have to add understanding. Because if you really do remember something in a rational way, a mindful way, then you must understand it. For example, I remember that my 8th grade girlfriend dumped me, but I don't understand why she dumped me. But in reality, I understand the fact that my 8th grade girlfriend dumped me. Are you with me? So I have the memory and the understanding of the memory, even though I don't have an understanding of her rationale. But that's for another story. Now the third factor we have to add here is will. This is going to be the toughest for me to convince you of, but just for the sake of argument, take Augustine at his word that for you to truly have a memory that is a mindful or rational one, then you must understand it, and you must have this will to understand it. For example, you all have some memory deep down inside of you that I am about to withdraw from your understanding through the force of my will. Are you ready? This latent memory is about to come forth when I summon it. The memory I will use your reason to summon forth by saying, and now you are all thinking about the memory of the number 4. You see, you had this memory all along, but until your understanding was engaged, which I did by the force of my powerful professor will, then this memory became an understanding that's a rational one, a functional one, one you willed to use. Okay, that's all a bit strange. But for the sake of argument, we're going to leave it at that and now try to see how this applies to the Trinity for Augustine. For Augustine, and remember we're talking about the 3 persons here, Father, Son, and Spirit, these 3 persons function together in an analogy like your mind does, when your mind consists of memory, has understanding, and will. Of all the memories you have, you can even remember yourself, and you can understand the memory of yourself. So now you would ask, in this idea of not 1 person but 2 persons, understanding, then what is the substance of this understanding? And if the mind really does understand its own memory of itself, then the substance of this understanding is the same substance as the memory itself. The 2 are in fact homoousios. Now you can probably see where this is going with our third entity here. We're going to talk about the will, the memory of oneself, that one understands of oneself. One can also will to understand of oneself. And so what is the substance of this third persona here? Well, if one truly understands the memory of oneself, then your will to understand that memory is the same substance as the memory itself and the understanding of the memory itself. We have 3 that are now homoousios. Now, is this everything we were looking for in those earlier models? Maybe. There is still a potential problem here. We have said all along that there seems to be a priority of the memory over the understanding and the will. We would also have to admit there seems to be an ongoing hierarchy here within these three persona. So is this some form of subordinationism? Well, you see how it is the memory of oneself that logically is prior to the understanding of oneself, and it is logically prior to the will to understand oneself, and this will is a product of the memory and of the understanding itself. The understanding is born by the memory, and the will proceeds from the memory and from the understanding of the memory. So again, we have that filioque clause as that last arrow here. But remember, for Augustine, this is a logical priority, not a chronological priority. When did God understand and want to understand? Well, always, eternally. And this is not an ontological hierarchy because they are all the same substance. And so there can't be an ontological subordination here, even though there is a causological hierarchy. Okay, one final problem, which Augustine is actually going to flip and make it his strongest point. It looks like we have all three are now impersonal. We had, in that first model, the Father as lover and the Son as beloved, and the Spirit seemed like an impersonal love. And in that second model, we had the mind, which is clearly a personal, active agent, and then simply knowledge of the mind, love of the mind. They seemed impersonal, like its. So we went from one impersonal spirit to two impersonal, the Word and breath of God. Well, now it seems like we have all three impersonal. But for Augustine, this is actually a strength. All three are now equally same substance, and yes, things like memory, understanding, and will don't look personal to us, but Augustine is fully aware that this idea of persona is too risky of a term. So it's not the only analogy we give here. Remember, our Greek word was hypostasis, which we could translate as a subsistence, whatever that means, or an entity. Here we have three entities that are same substance. Now, why go into all of this super abstract way of talking about God? Why not just keep with a more personal, biblical way? Well, the answer is Augustine would completely agree. Augustine has gone out of his way in the first 8 books on the Trinity to do exactly that. And yet there are still people who teach subordinationism, people he would call Arians, who are denying that there can be any analogy found anywhere in all creation of 3 hypostases that are homoousios with each other. And Augustine has been able to show that within one's own mind, which is the image of God, we have exactly that. 3 entities that are homoousios. If it's possible for us feeble humans in our feeble mind, it's certainly possible for God.
Okay, this is where you give yourself a big pat on the back. Good work, everybody. We've got Augustine's model down. So in the next video, we're going to simply take a big step back, breath of fresh air, and kind of figure out, well, how do these models compare to one another? What are the strengths and weaknesses? And what do we believe about all of this today? So thanks for sticking with Augustine. I'll see you next time.